Islamism as an ideological movement originated in the late 19th century in reaction to the perceived and real superiority of the West over the Muslim world. And in that period, the texts produced by Islamists, you get the feeling that the power politics between the West and then the Muslim world is a game, and then the West was playing that game fairly. And because of its certain superiorities, political, economic, and even cultural, the West was winning. So there is an element of respect and appreciation of the power of the West. And then the solution Islamism provided, offered to the Muslim societies is to look and study the West sincerely and adopt the things that make the West powerful, and so that the Muslim world can catch up with the West. So the West was playing the game fairly and then winning. What the Muslims should have done is to play according to the same rules. But the Islamism also claimed that Islam as a religion has some superior aspects, especially when it comes to moral issues. So Islam is morally superior over the morality of the West. So the Muslims should have kept those values to themselves, but import from the West those things that make the West superior. This is how it started. This is how the Islamist imagination of the West started. But this began to change with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and then with especially 1930s, with the introduction of anti-Semitic literature into Turkey. And that literature developed in Europe, and then, as we know from the European history, anti-Semitism is very, very old. But before the 19th century, that literature was heavily religious in nature. So the accusations against the Jews was religious. So they killed Jesus, they do this, they do that. With the 19th century, however, the accusations changed in nature. It became more political economy in nature. What do I mean by that is that with the capitalism developing in Europe, the Jews accumulated unimaginable financial and economic wealth with which they was dominating politics as well. And eventually in the late 19th century, this literature began to claim that there is this international Jewish conspiracy which is going to conquer the whole world and make all the kings subordinate them. And unfortunately, we know what happened in Europe with how this literature affected later on in the 20th century, and then the Holocaust, of course. This literature also penetrated into Islamism, and then in the 1930s, and what this introduction or penetration affected the Islamism is that it undermined or it weakened that admiration Islamism felt towards Europe. Because right now what was happening in their imagination is that the West was not playing power politics fairly, but rather conspiring. Here the Jews and then the West is really affiliated with one another. So when the Jews, international Jewish international Jewry and then the Western power are so associated with one another. The West and Jews were using one another to dominate the Muslim world. And then what happened is that Europe or the West was not that fair player anymore, but rather conspiring against Muslims, undermining their unity, and then exploiting their resources. And that is the time when Islamism lost its interest in the Western values and Europe, and began to see the West in a very, very negative light. And that light is that we Muslims are subordinate to the West, weakened vis-a-vis the West, not because of our problems, but because of the conspiracy the West has been trying to realize in the Muslim world. And that conspiracy had different forms. One of them is, for example, the division of the Muslim world into numerous smaller nation states. And of course, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire is also another, the Western conspiracy. And then, more importantly, is that the West installed in power in the Muslim world those westernized, alienated political elites. And this is how the West is dominant over the Muslim world, because there are Western puppets in power in the Muslim world. And this is still the dominant idea Islamism nurtures and Islamism keeps as the image of the West. It is not rival anymore, honorable rival, a rival to be respected. It was the case in the late 19th century, but right now it's an enemy. It's an enemy that has to be fought along multiple fronts. Well, here, first of all, Turkish society is extremely heterogeneous. It's not just made of one ethnic group. We are talking about Turks predominantly, but also there are Kurds as well in that society. There are people who see themselves as Turks but migrated from the Caucasus and Balkans as well. So we have to keep this in mind. So when we are talking about Turkish society, we are not talking about a homogeneous entity. This society is also divided according to religion. Majority of them are Sunni, but there are also Alawites among them. And furthermore, this is even more important, that even the Sunnis are themselves divided. Some of them are pious Muslims, some of them are not. So here, that it is difficult to say Turkish society sees itself as part of the West or not. But if we have to generate, keeping these points as a reservation about what I am going to say right now, I guess an overwhelming majority of the Turkish society does not see itself as a Western society. Even the secular Turks are proudly Turkish. And then, of course, the pious Muslims are proudly pious Muslims. And then these two identities, religious and ethnic identity, I guess the overwhelming majority of them see as what makes Turkish society distinct and different from the European society. Yet, the Turkish society, again I am talking about overwhelming society, if you look at the surveys, overwhelming majority of them want to join the European Union as part of the journey. But it is not because the Turkish society, again, overwhelmingly share the same political values. I mean, Turkish society, in terms of freedom of religion, in terms of freedom of speech, unfortunately remain short of the European ideals or the European Union cherish. I am sure that most of the Turkish society is going to fail if take any exam on those European values. But I guess the European Union is for most of them, or not most of them, is an economic opportunity. So it's an opportunity to go freely to another country, Germany, France, or Italy, or Austria. Well, Austria, I don't know. I mean, the general idea is really Germany. So with this membership in the European Union, many Turks, especially from low middle income families, entertain the idea that we can go to Europe and work. Upper classes want to join the European Union because it is really difficult to get European visa. So membership in the European Union is going to give upper class Turks unhindered access to capital cities, Paris, of course, Vienna's beautiful city, and other European historical towns. Well, big time. The transformation I mentioned in the 1930s, in which that the European image became or changed from rival into enemy, happened right after Atatürk reforms, Atatürk's secularization reforms. And if I have to just summarize what those reforms are, it is those reforms which secularized Turkey, at least on the surface. Even though it is not the same kind of secularization, state secularization, that happened in Europe, still the Turkish secularization was, by its time, the most radical in terms of separating the state and religion, and it had remained so. I don't recall any other Muslim society which secularized the state as further as Mustafa Kemal did, with the exception of maybe Tunisia. Even in Tunisia, as far as I know, the state religion remained Islam. So Atatürk reforms were, from an Islamist perspective, was unacceptably harsh on religion in terms of restricting religion's role in the state and over the state. So the Islamist judgment of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, is extremely harsh, has always been harsh. And then I can enumerate what kind of charges brought against him. For example, one popular charge is that he is an agent of the West. So West, well, I mean, this is of course historically incorrect, but we are living in post-truth age. Well, Islamists were living in post-truth age well before the others. They reconstructed the history in a different way, and then usually thought or portrayed Mustafa Kemal as a Western agent, which diminished the role of Islam, which destroyed the Caliphate, which abolished the Sultanate, so as to appease its Western masters. And actually, so Mustafa Kemal is associated with the West. So Mustafa Kemal's alleged anti-Islam is associated with alleged West's alleged anti-Islam. So anti-Islam of the West and anti-Islam of Mustafa Kemal are closely linked in the imagination of the West. So Mustafa Kemal's reforms made that huge impact, and that is still the dominant view of the Mustafa Kemal's reforms. Okay, Justice and Development Party, AK Party, Adalet and Kalkınma Partisi, which is the ruling party right now in Turkey, came to power in 2002. And then in the last 20 years is ruling Turkey uninterruptedly. Justice and Development Party, despite its original claim that it is just a conservative Democrat party, and then in that they modeled the European Christian Democrat parties, hailed from Islamism in Turkey. So their leadership grown and then embraced the Islamist ideology, at least when they were young, and then later on entered politics. Only when they entered politics in 2000, and then when Justice and Development Party won the election, they claimed that they are no longer Islamist, but they claimed that we are conservative Democrats. Of course, you cannot just take off your ideologies like you take off your jacket, right? So the Islamist imagination that I described earlier was very well settled among Islamists of Turkey by the late 20th century. By the time Justice and Development Party came to power, that imagination was already settled and unquestioned among Islamists. So Justice and Development Party leadership embraced that imagination held that imagination, and I don't recall any instance where they seemed to drop that imagination. They imagined the West as an enemy, which means the following: when you have that kind of an imagination, your relations with the West is not going to be based on some shared political ideals, but rather it's going to be strategic or tactical. And in the early 2000s, because of the strategic tactical considerations, what I mean by strategic tactical considerations is that Islamism was not that strong at that time. Erdogan was not that consolidated in power. There was still very vibrant anti-Islamist Kemalist coalition in society as well as in the state, in the armed forces. Turkish armed forces were staunchly secular, and then they really didn't like Erdogan, and then this continued all the way to 2010. So in that time, in order to undermine the power of the anti-Islamist and Kemalist forces, Kemalist referring to Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's people who embrace his ideals. They were strong in military, they were strong in judiciary, they were strong in universities and in civil society. Then they had been against Erdogan from day one. In that context, Erdogan needed local allies from beyond its societal base, and then Turkish liberals provided that alliance or entered into alliance with Erdogan at that time. And also Europe and the United States and European states saw in Erdogan a representative of moderate Islam. And if you remember, that is the time when it's after 9/11, Al-Qaeda is waging terrorist attacks in the United States and also threatening Europe. And then the Americans and then the Europeans wanted to have an Islamist leader who can be an antidote to extremist Al-Qaeda. And Erdogan played that role. Erdogan portrayed himself as that moderate Muslim leader with whom Americans and then the Europeans can work. From Erdogan's perspective, this was to undermine his own enemies at home, which was the Kemalist establishment. So the 2000s were the period in which that it was a tactical and strategic alliance Erdogan established. But once as Erdogan got rid of the Kemalists, then he could no longer had to appease the West as he used to do in the 2000s, and I guess he began to act more out of his own personal conviction again, which has a very negative image of the West. Okay, the same. I guess the AK Party's relations with the West is going to be strategic and tactical, which means that I don't think that AKP wants to totally alienate it from the West. So there is this discussion of whether Turkey is moving from the West towards Russia and then China. I don't think that Erdogan really wants that. Erdogan wants to be accepted by the West and then the United States, like the United States and West accepts Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt. What is the difference from Erdogan's perspective between him and the leaders of these countries? If West is dealing with them, why the West is not dealing with Erdogan? So I don't think that Erdogan wants to push Turkey away from the West. What Erdogan wants to have is to have a relationship with the West based on the fact that Europe accepts him and Turkey as it is. So I don't think that Erdogan wants to be fully in Eastern Bloc, which is Russia and China right now. I don't think that he wants to totally plunge Turkey into that alliance. But he also does not want to be fully a Western ally, so acting kind of strategically and tactically with the both sides, and that is the Turkey-West relations in the last 10 years. Of course, that last 10 years was difficult for both West and Erdogan and AKP, of course, because Europe used to see Justice and Development Party in a different light in the 2000s. In 2010s was a period of transition. It was a recalibration of relations. And I believe that once the West accepts Erdogan and then the AKP as it is, not as it's imagined, I guess the relations are going to have a working relationship. It's going to be transactional. I guess Erdogan and then all the AK Party leaders truly enjoy coming to Europe. So I don't think that why he should be deprived of that. At least this is his thinking. And maybe the Americans and Europeans, of course, see him as a power to reckon with, and representing somehow the Muslim world is also another, I guess, idea that he entertains. Well, here I should clarify one thing about Islamism in Turkey. Usually Islamism is a modern religious movement which has generated its own grassroots movements elsewhere in the Muslim world. In the Turkish case, there is this peculiar feature of Islamism, which has not generated its own grassroots religious movement, like it did, for example, in Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood, or like it did in Pakistan or elsewhere. But what happened is that Islamism became attached to Sufi orders. So prominent Islamists that we talk about today are also members of Sufi orders, and one of them is Naqshbandi order. Necip Fazıl, for example, a Turkish poet most associated with Islamism in Turkey, is a member of a Naqshi Sufi order. Erdogan respects the Sufi sheikhs a lot, personally visits them frequently, and also his the person who was instrumental in bringing Erdogan into politics, Necmettin Erbakan. Before Erdogan, he was the face of Turkish political Islam in Turkey. He was himself a disciple of a Naqshi Sufi sheikh. So whatever I say about Islamism in Turkey is in one way or another, it's also about Naqshbandi Sufi order, because these two are so closely linked and has been affiliated with one another for so long time. And this is partly also the reason why Turkish Islamism has been less assertive in demanding the implementation of the Sharia compared to, for example, Arab Islamists. So this is the Sufi aspect of Turkish Islamism, and then Naqshbandism and then Islamism are almost the two sides of the same coin. About Turkish Islamism, the only grassroots movement it generated is Nurculuk, out of which also the Gülenist has grown, and other Nurcu movements. But they have not been also very much against, even though they keep a distance to Sufi orders, in one way or another they engage with one another, and their image of the West are not that different from each other. Let me end this with the following anecdote. Actually, Islamist imagination of, for example, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk is very much borrows from Said Nursi, who is the founder of the Nurcu movement. So the movements are here. It's really hard to disentangle in terms of when we are talking about the image of the West.